I'd like to exploit the opportunity, but it would be exploiting. I talked too long altogether. I think it would be more constructive to turn it over to the audience.
Well, I think we would like to hear.
Okay. Well, there are a couple of, there's several themes that were brought up which are quite accurate and could be extended. So, Antonia pointed out, among other things, that there's a debate going on about Afghanistan and its policies. There's a kind of a debate going on, but it's sort of a strange one. One voice is missing in the debate: Afghans. They're not supposed to participate. And it's taken for granted. Like, nobody talks about it. It's our world. We own it. We run it. We'll decide what to do in our interest. And it doesn't mean you and me. It means those who control policy and control the economy. They'll decide, and nobody else's voice matters. It doesn't matter what the American population thinks, and what the Afghans think amounts to zero. At least you see some references to the fact that the U.S. population is opposed. What about the Afghans? They're not supposed to play any part in this decision. Well, it's not that they're silent. They're not silent. For example, there's an Afghan peace movement, pretty significant one. They have some very eloquent spokespersons. We don't know exactly the scale of it because, you don't investigate that kind of thing. You try to count, the number of people with guns or something like that, but not the peace movement. But there is information about it. One of the most eloquent spokespersons, if you haven't read her, you should, is Malalai Joya, who's an incredible young woman, I guess not so young anymore, who lived through the Russian occupation, the warlord regime, U.S.-backed warlords after the Russian occupation tore the country to shreds under the Taliban, who were actually welcomed because the warlords were so monstrous. And under the current regime, which is the warlords again, it's called the Karzai regime. And throughout this whole period, she's been constantly engaged in constructive opposition, things like trying to organize girls' schools in villages, health programs, and so on. How she survived is a miracle. She was elected to the parliament with plenty of support, but continued to criticize the members of the parliament, the warlord gangsters. And she was thrown out of the parliament. She's living underground, heavy protection. But she has a voice. And she has a book that just came out a while ago, which is very eloquent. She sometimes speaks. She may be speaking here. But her basic point is the same as that of the Afghan peace movement. What she says is, look, we're perfectly happy to have an invasion from the West, an invasion of schools, hospitals, development. Should be, she doesn't say it, but we should. An invasion of reparations for the crimes we've committed against them. That's a fine invasion, but we don't want an invasion of guns and tanks. That's only going to recreate the horrors. Now we live under the threat of the Taliban, the warlords, the NATO forces, and that's what we want to get rid of. We'll work things out for ourselves somehow. Well, that voice, again, we don't really know how broad it is, but it seems to be significant, and it's silenced. It's silenced because we allow it to be silenced. It shouldn't be. The kind of debate that's going on in Washington should not be permitted to take place. It doesn't matter what your view is, because it's not up to us or Washington to decide what ought to be done in Afghanistan. Invaders have no rights. They only have responsibilities, and that should be understood. Well, that's a voice that's missing. Steve said something actually David in his opening remarks mentioned something quite relevant, which Steve and then David later picked up. He pointed out that the church was at the forefront of eliminating slavery in the United States. But slavery wasn't eliminated in the United States. We know that some amendments were passed during the Second World War, Civil War, but they were never implemented. They were briefly. There was a period of about 10 years, Reconstruction, when there was sort of semi-freedom, limited freedom for the black slaves. It ended in 1877 with a compact between the parties, the North and the South. And what happened after that was criminalizing black life, exactly what both of you talked about, criminalizing the life of the poor, which meant blacks. And it was done, and now it's done by charges of having a joint in your pocket or something, or some other thing. Then it was done by vagrancy or talking too loudly when a white woman is around or some other charge. But effectively, black life was criminalized. And once you were caught in the criminal system, you could never get out of it because you had to pay the costs of the courts, which you couldn't pay, and so it's permanent. So in fact, a permanent slave labor force was formed by starting 10 years after the Civil War. And that form of slavery was much worse than actual slavery for very good capitalist reasons. In fact, reasons that the slave owners used to justify having slaves. And nobody ever answered their arguments. Their arguments were that owning slaves is more moral than renting people. If you own, to be anachronistic, if you own a car, you're going to take care of it. If you rent a car, chances are you won't take care of it. The car will be better off a couple of years later if it's owned. And that was their argument for slavery, much more moral than what's called free labor, that is renting people. Well, the criminalized system under which black life was criminalized, that created a slave labor force where the owners, the masters, had no responsibility. They had no capital investment in the workforce. So they treated them miserably. If you look at the record, it's much worse than slavery. And it's not a small thing. That's a large part of the core of the American Industrial Revolution that took place in the late 19th, early 20th century. A lot of it was based on slave labor, treated much worse than slavery. That lasted until the Second World War. Second World War, there was a need for what's called free labor. You had to have labor for war industry and so on. So, this second worst kind of slavery kind of ended. And in the early post-war period, it was a period of substantial economic growth, best in economic history, in fact, went on until the 70s. And then there was a need for openings for labor, skilled, blue-collar labor. And African Americans had a chance to move into the society and get a job in an auto plant, get a pretty good contract from UAW, buy a house, have a car, and so on. Well, that ended around the mid-'70s with the neoliberal period being initiated. That's a period of financialization of the economy, sending productive capacity abroad because it's more profitable for the owners and managers, setting workers around the world in competition with one another, which of course lowers wages. That's the point of the trade agreements. Meanwhile, protecting professionals so they're not in competition with each other, so they stay wealthy and do fine. And of course, the owners and the managers, riches beyond the dreams of avarice, as we've seen in the last 25 years. That's the World Trade Organization. That's what's called globalization. Well, that ended the options for black Americans quite significantly, except for a small sector that could kind of make it into the, Harvard Law School. But you got to do something with them. These people who are now superfluous. Well, in Colombia, they do something with them. It's called social cleansing, limpieza social. You send out the paramilitaries and you kill them. Well, we're more civilized. So what we do here is throw them into jail by criminalizing the life of the poor, as both of you pointed out. The pretext, you've got to have a pretext. So the pretext is drugs, but nobody can take that seriously. I mean, just as you can't take seriously the drug war in Colombia. Those are just pretexts. It's our form of social cleansing. And if you take a look at African American history, from the day that the first slave was brought here until today, there's been maybe 25 years, maybe 30 years of some form of freedom. And now it's Hispanics as well, and that's the incarceration rate, as you all know, has gone through the skies.